What's going on, everybody? Jason here, your local real estate expert in the Manteca, Lathrop, and Ripon area. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. There's going to be all kinds of content like this and community-related content. Of course, if you haven't already watched the first two videos in this series, definitely go back and watch those. They're going to give you a good knowledge base for what we're going to be covering today, which is the residential purchase agreement or the purchase contract for California. We're going to be trying to dive through it as quickly as possible, but also going as in-depth as we can because I want you guys to be confident when it comes to signing this contract, whether it be with me, one of my coworkers, or another realtor entirely. I want you guys to have as much confidence as possible when signing the contract, knowing what you're getting yourself into. I'm guilty of it myself sometimes if I have a buyer that has purchased a home before, of not going super deep into the details of the contract. And it does change from time to time. So I'm using the 2022 version. Maybe you have seen a previous version. So let's get into it without further ado. So some of you may know, some of you may not know that the purchase agreement that you sign is not necessarily just one document. It's actually a collection of documents that are required by the state of California, the DRE, Department of Real Estate. So this first document here is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. We refer to it as the AD. Now, what this does is it sets up the relationships between each agent and their client. So it lays out the function of the agent and their duties to each client. So you have a seller's agent, a buyer's agent, and potentially an agent that will represent both the buyer and the seller. That's not super common, but there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's done fairly and the negotiations are done honestly, and you have a fiduciary responsibility to both the buyer and the seller, so we can't be giving away too much information either side. And then it goes over the seller and buyer's responsibilities as pertains to this contract. And then this second section, the second page, is a glossary of terms, what they're talking about when what the contract is talking about when they use words like buyer and seller. Listing price, offer price. Just breaks those down into the basics. Okay, the second form is the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. This is actually a new one. For 2022, may have been around 2021 as well, but it's something that is a required part of the purchase contract now. Basically sets out that there are protected classes in California, such as people with disabilities, and then and basically just says that you are not allowed to discriminate against anyone based on race, creed, color, disability, sexual orientation, etc. Never had that come up before, but just lays out the laws and requires you to agree to follow the laws. And then it has some resources. If you have any questions or concerns regarding that, you can read more information at these websites. And then if you think that you may have a reason for an exception, talk to a lawyer, essentially. Okay, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Agents sometimes have more than one buyer, and a lot of time, or I shouldn't say a lot of times, but every now and then we have two or more, maybe even more buyers that are interested in the exact same property. In that case, this lays out that A, that's a possibility, and B, that everything has to be done above board. We can't favor one buyer over the other. And in the case that we may be Working with multiple sellers, same thing. We can't favor one over the other. And then if you're in dual agency representing both the buyer and the seller in a transaction, we have to be fair to both sides. We all sign that. And this is all filled in with information from a listing that one of my coworkers has. Actually, a beautiful listing in Oakdale, if anybody's looking in Oakdale. Great. Huge house and gorgeous. This is the Wire Fraud and Electronic Funds Transfer Advisory. Essentially, it goes over how to do a wire transfer, the steps you should take to make sure that your information and that wire is safe, and then also lays out that committing wire fraud, such as writing a bad check or something like that, is punishable by law. Okay, then we get into the meat and potatoes of it, the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. So this first page lays out all of the information regarding the property, the seller's brokerage firm, the buyer's brokerage firm, obviously the address, assessor's parcel number will normally be filled in. I left it off this one. The name of the buyers here, John and Jane Doe in this case. Maybe you one day. And then this kind of says that there are also other forms as part of this package. This section lays out the basic terms: purchase price, close of escrow, typically 30 days, but that's negotiable. It can be as little as 5 days with an all cash offer. If you're doing an all cash offer, that goes over here. It could be as long as 45 or even 60 days. All that's negotiable, and that's part of the terms of when you're writing an offer. Those terms can vary, and they can make an offer more or less enticing to a seller. Expiration of offer. The standard is 3 calendar days. Again, you can change that if you want to give them a week. If you want to force their hand, give them 1 day. It's up to you. Initial deposit amount. The standard in this area is 1%. You really don't want to come in with less than 1%. It just kind of shows that you're not ready to buy if you don't have at least 1%. Even if you're doing 100% financing, you are still going to need some funds for things like inspections, appraisal, a lot of times closing costs. So you are going to need some money even if you're doing 100% financing. And this just shows that you have some money. You also have to include a proof of funds, which is essentially just a bank statement. But the amount of money you're willing to put into the deposit account, into the escrow account, can affect your offer. And then if you're going to do an increase of your deposit amount upon removal of contingencies or on a date or whatever, you can add that in there. Your loan amount is based on what your lender tells us. If you're doing FHA, it's going to be 96.5% of the purchase price because you'll be putting 3.5% down. And then if you're doing a conventional, it could be anything. It could be as little as 3% all the way up to 20, 50, however much money you have. But this just says what your actual loan amount is going to be. And then you can also put in an interest rate. You can say a fixed rate or initial adjustable rate, not to exceed a certain percentage. In the best of times, we like to throw that in there. Right now, we kind of like to put that in there because rates are adjusting so frequently. We want to put an amount not to exceed. That way, if it jumps up beyond your capability to fulfill, that we have an out. And this kind of comes back to that deposit amount. If for any reason you do have to cancel the contract, either because of an issue with the house itself that comes up in either appraisal or investigations, inspections, you have an out. And then also if for whatever reason you can no longer purchase the home, you can no longer qualify for the loan, either because the rate went up too high, something happened in your life, like you lost your job or something like that. We have a way to get your deposit back, typically minus a couple of fees if we've decided to pay for inspections out of escrow, or appraisal out of escrow. That's typically not the case anymore. You usually have to pay for that up front, but if any of those are coming out of escrow, then that will still be paid for via escrow, and then you get the balance back. Additional financing amount. This is if you're doing, a second or even a second and a third loan to cover down payment and closing costs, something like CalHEFA. That would be an additional financed amount. Also back here, just to backtrack a touch, if we are doing an FHA or VA, then there's another form that we have to throw in there. And then occupancy type, is this going to, if it's primary, you leave it blank. If it's secondary or investment home, you have to check those. There's different ways that it goes if it's going to be a secondary or an investment home. Different qualifications for your loan amounts. If it's going to be an investment home, as a seller's agent, I like to see you having more money down, things like that. You're going to need at least 15% for a secondary or a investment home. Seller credit, if any, to the buyer. This was completely out at the beginning of 2022. Just wasn't happening. It's back. So if you do need money to help you with your down payment or closing costs, this is where we would ask for it from the seller. And they are definitely willing these days. Obviously, you can't go asking for $50,000 on a $400,000 home, but you can ask for some. I don't like to go over 2.5%. I've seen some people go as high as 3%. That's about the max, though. By 3%, I mean 3% of the purchase price. So on a $500,000 home, no more than $15,000 is my suggestion, and even that's can be a bit of a stretch. Verification of all cash. If you are doing an all cash offer, you need to provide proof that you have the funds, or verification of down payment and closing costs. Again, you need to provide a bank statement, retirement account statement, something wherever you're getting that money from for down payment and closing costs. Verification of loan application. This actually typically comes prior to this. We'll have a pre-approval letter. But these boxes, pre-qualification, if you remember from our previous video, means that you've spoken to a lender and you've told them how much you make, how much you've made the last couple of years. It's basically just like a verbal pre-qualification. Pre-approval means that you've given them your documentation, they've run your credit, whole nine, and they're pre-approving you. That's a more solid one. A fully underwritten pre-approval means you're really far down the line. You can probably close in 21 days. And that's excellent if we can get you that far prior to writing the offer. That makes your offer even stronger. Final verification of condition. This is toward the end of escrow. We'll go in and check. I like to do that once people are actually moved out of the house. So I like to shorten this up to about 3 days prior to close of escrow. You do technically have like up to 5 days after escrow to double check everything, and if there's any kind of damage or anything like that that is obviously the seller's fault, they would have to take care of that. Loans. So this is where we would agree to remove our loan contingency. Now, if you're just in the pre-approval process or your pre-qualification, we leave that at 17 days. If you're to the pre-approval stage, we can shorten that a bit maybe. If you're already to the underwritten, fully underwritten stage, we can reduce that even more. And again, reducing these times can make your offer more attractive. Appraisal contingency. I like to leave that as is because you never really know when an appraiser is going to be able to get out there. At the beginning of the year and even last year when rates were really, really low and there were a lot of refinances, it was really hard to get appraisers out to properties, and we'd have to push this out sometimes as much as 25 or 30 days even, because it was just too difficult to find people to actually come out and do the appraisal. But now we're back to normal. 17 days is typically plenty. Investigation of property, I typically shorten this down to 10 days because I know that I can get a inspector out there fairly quickly. I schedule those the day we get accepted. I'm online or on the phone scheduling the inspectors, and I get them out there as soon as possible. Again, shortening these times helps your offer. Informational access to the property. That's not necessarily just including inspections. That can also be if you wanted to have a contractor come out and give you a bid on a new kitchen or flooring or whatever. You also can do that. But those rights aren't unlimited. You can't just stop by whenever. And typically you want that to be done in the first 16, week to 2 weeks. I like to leave that matching with the investigation of property, so 10 days. If you do need a little bit more time, if you have a contractor that can't get out there right away, though, we can leave that at 17. Review of seller documents. Once we actually get into contract, there's going to be a ton of documents that come from the seller. They're called disclosures, detailing any issues that there are with the property. There's typically, one or two things that are going on. You're buying something that's used, essentially, in most cases. So nothing's going to be 100% perfect. And it's good to have honest sellers that let you know if there's any kind of small problem with the house. Could just be noise. You live near train tracks, something like that. But it's good to know. And you have a certain amount of time to review those documents. They typically have 3 days to get those to you after acceptance, and then you'll have up to 17 days to review them and then continue on or back out based on those. Common interest disclosures. Again, this is part of who owns the property. And that's typically taken care of through the preliminary title report. And then same thing with leased and liened items. If there's anything that's leased and tied to the property, such as solar, they have to let you know. You get to review all of that and decide whether or not you can continue based on that. Things like solar, PACE, and HERO loans, they have to go with the property, or you have to figure out if the seller can pay those off with funds that they'll be receiving from the sale. That's part of the negotiation process. Sale of buyer's property. We're back into a situation where that's difficult to get accepted because homes are taking so long to sell these days that a lot of times sellers don't necessarily want to deal with somebody who has to put their property on the market and sell it, because it could take a month, 2 months to even get into escrow, which means they have to sit there and wait. But if you do need to sell your property, or if you're already in escrow selling to sell your property, but you still want to protect yourself a bit, say your property falls out of escrow for whatever reason, and you can't buy the house based on that, you definitely want this form. Time of possession. Typically, it's just whenever the county recorder records the new deed, but it can be specified really specifically here. If the seller needs the weekend or something like that, you can change the date, put a time. Seller occupied or vacant units. Pretty self-explanatory. But if the seller is going to remain in possession for say 30 days, which was typical, not so much anymore. But if they did need to do a rent back or something like that, this will be part of that. There's another form called an SIP, which is the seller in possession form that gives kind of lays out what they're going to pay you for that time that they're going to remain in the house. Could be zero if you're very nice, or it could be market rate rent. And then this is again seller delivery of documents. They have 7 days. I like to adjust this to 3. sign and return escrow holder provisions, instructions. They have 5 days. HOA documents, very important. They have 3 days to get you those because something in there could change your mind quite a bit. Smoke alarms, CO detectors, water heater bracing. That has to be in there before the appraisal happens. Otherwise, the appraiser is going to have to come back out. So I typically, when we see the house, I'll kind of keep my eyes out for these things and make sure that they're already done. But if they're not, then definitely they only have those 7 days because they got to get those done before the appraisal happens. And then evidence of representative authority. If somebody has power of attorney or is handling this for a trust or something like that, then they have to show evidence that they are the person that has that authority. This section here is all of the things that are included and excluded from the sale. Rule of thumb is that anything that is screwed into the wall or to the floor stays. That's changed slightly with things like video doorbells and security cameras and things like that because they're so expensive. Sometimes people like to take them with them. If that is something that you want to keep, that you noticed was there, then you definitely want to check all these boxes that you want to keep. Refrigerators, that's 50-50. You can always ask. They can always counter and say, no, we want our refrigerator. You can ask for as much as you want. The seller does not have to agree to that. They could just say, we accept all of your terms, but we're keeping our video doorbell and our security cameras and our refrigerator, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's bolted in, such as a built-in microwave, built-in stove, things like that, those just about always stay. This section is allocation of costs. So in San Joaquin and Stanislaus County, the seller pays for things like natural hazard disclosures. That is something that will tell you if you're in a flood zone, if you're in a high fire zone, things like that. Smoke alarms, CO detectors, and water heater bracing. Again, those should be there already, but the seller needs to pay for them if they're not. Government required point of sale inspections reports. This can go back and forth. Typically, the buyer in our area pays for any inspections that need to be done. Corrective remedial actions, again, seller in this case would need to pay for anything that's government mandated. Now, if it's just standard, upkeep type things, that's negotiable. Escrow fees are split 50-50 in both San Joaquin and Stanislaus. Owner's title insurance policy, that is split 50-50 in San Joaquin, but typically paid for by the seller in Stanislaus County. But again, all of these are negotiable. If you want to make a super strong offer and pay for all these yourself as a buyer, you're more than welcome to. Or if you're short on funds and a couple $100 is going to make the difference, you can ask the seller to pay for all of them. HOA fees, that's the seller. HOA certification fees, the buyer. Transfer fees, I typically ask for the seller to pay for those. Private transfer fees, these are rare, but usually I say both and split 50-50. And then other fees. Home warranty plan, I just about always ask for the seller to pay for one of these. That'll cover you for a year if anything goes wrong. It's inexpensive to get it fixed. The seller does not necessarily have to agree to do that. And if they don't, then me personally, I like to buy you one if at all possible. Property type addenda is just if it's a specific type of property like a probate, manufactured home, tenant occupied, tenant in common, anything like that, then there has to be an addenda added to this to the sale package that describes that. And then there's all kinds of other addendas, a short sale, a backup offer, if there's a septic well, all kinds of little things like that. Buyer and seller advisories, these four are automatically part of the package. If any of these others apply, they also need to be added. And then kind of this whole section 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. What those are, pretty much all of these, is just a glossary of terms. They describe what all of the kind of standard terms within this contract mean. So if you ever have any questions about what anything means on there, go ahead and refer to this whole section, and they'll break down what they mean by each of these terms. It's really good, especially for first-time buyers that may have a question about what does possession necessarily mean. Then go check out this section. $29 is a liquidated damages section. If the buyer fails to complete this is really, really important, so I'm going to read it. If the buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, this is after we've released all of those contingencies. There's typically 3. That's the inspection contingency, the appraisal contingency, and a loan contingency. If after all of those are released and the buyer defaults, in other words, does not close, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid, so your earnest money deposit minus any fees that need to be paid out of it. If the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, one of which the buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. So if you did put 5% in there for whatever reason, or maybe you had an escalator where you put more in there each every 10 days or after you released each contingency, the max they can keep is 3% of that purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer. Release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from both the buyer and seller, judicial decision or arbitration award. At the time of any increased deposit, buyer and seller shall sign a separate liquidated damages provision incorporating the increased deposit as liquidated damages. Okay. Section 30 is mediation. So we don't go from buyer didn't perform or seller didn't perform straight to the courts. We start with mediation, and you're agreeing to that. Then we move into the arbitration period. Now, what this does is kind of just speeds everything up. The judicial process, the court process, takes forever. Mediation and arbitration take much, much less time. It's far less expensive. That's why we do that first. And then if all that fails, then we move into having a judge rule. You don't really want to get there. Most of the time it's handled through mediation, arbitration. And this kind of just goes over everything that you're agreeing to as far as that goes. Expiration of offer. And then entity buyers, a representative capacity disclosure is not required for legally authorized signers designated below. So if you're just a legally authorized signer for an entity, a court like an LLC that's purchasing things, like a lot of investors have LLCs that they're actually putting the house in, and they would be the legal representative of that entity. So that would refer to them. And then this is you as the buyer would sign here saying that this is my offer and I agree to all the terms. And then the seller can accept, do a seller counteroffer, ask if you're okay with being a backup offer by sending you a backup offer addendum. And then this again refers to entity sellers. And that's the exact same thing on the opposite side. If you have an LLC, but you're the legal person that can sign for that stuff, then you would do that there. And then the seller signatures, if you're just accepting, all this kind of stays blank and you just say, yep, I accept. If you don't even want to, if the seller doesn't want to accept or counter in any way, they would just say offer not accepted. We almost never do that, but if somebody asks, we can. You just send them an email saying, sorry, somebody beat you. And then this is the brokers section where we sign saying essentially that all this information is true and correct, and that we are the representatives of the buyer and seller. Escrow holder acknowledgement. If we do get in a contract, then the escrow holder, or in California, it's the title and escrow company, they fill out this section here. Okay, lastly, but here we have the buyer's investigation advisory. This basically just says, please get all the investigations you want done. We suggest, at the minimum, getting a home inspection, a roof inspection, and a pest inspection. For FHA, you are required to get a pest inspection. Now, you're not required to get any other inspections. If you're buying cash, you're buying conventionally, you don't have to get any inspections at all. But we suggest getting at least those inspections and then going over, of course, the natural hazard disclosure and things like that, making sure that it's okay. And then these are all the other inspections you could get. And this is you saying, like, as the buyer, I've been notified that I should get these things. Fair Appraisal Act. I'm sure some of you have seen things in the news with appraisers treating properties differently based on who owns them. This is something, it was always unacceptable, but we put it in the law now that it's unacceptable. So the appraisers have to treat everyone fairly, regardless of race, creed, color, sexual orientation. California Consumer Privacy Act, basically the terms of service that we're going to keep your information in-house, private. We're not going to be disseminating this to anybody. And that's the end of this packet. One other item that I will show you is the FHA VA amendatory clause. Now, if you are going FHA, you will also need to fill this out. It essentially just states that you're getting an FHA home. You put the purchase price here, or you're getting an FHA loan, I'm sorry, not home. And then you sign, we sign, the seller signs. All understanding that this is going to be an FHA or VA loan and that has different lending standards and investigation/inspection standards that have to be met. And that wraps it up. If, again, you guys have any questions whatsoever, throw them down in the comments. Reach out directly to me. I'm more than happy to answer any of the questions you might have. I'm always here to just chat about the buying process. I love, love, love educating people on this whole entire process. So, again, any questions whatsoever, please reach out. You guys have a fantastic day.